laugh, so I'm trying not to look at you or concentrate. Go.
Okay.
Go. What did you say to Chris? Good luck with your life. Hi, I'm Rachel Azaguri.
That's all I have to say. Okay.
And I'm Emily Milling.
That'll go in the outtakes.
Please do. And this is the ventureLAB podcast. This month we sit down with Chris Cory, one of the ventureLAB executive in residence, to talk about crowdfunding.
And crowdfunding for equity, a new way to find investors for your company. There's a lot to talk about, so we'll be posting a few resources in the show notes for this episode for anyone that wants to learn more about these topics and how to apply it to your own business.
We also chat with Kailey Gilchrist, the sauce boss at Nona Vegan, a company that produces vegan pasta sauces to help bring flavor to allergy and special diet foods using cashews and other tasty ingredients.
Kailey has a lot coming up very soon, so keep an eye out for Nona Vegan sauces in your grocery store.
As always, you can find us online at venturelab.ca, on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram, or tweet us at venturelabca.
If you have any questions, send us an email at hello@venturelab.ca.
Let's get started and check in with ventureLAB's president and CEO, Jeremy Laurin.
Okay, Jeremy, what's on your mind this month?
What I want to talk about this month is a reminder to entrepreneurs and maybe everybody to never underestimate the value of speaking and making your point using analogies. I was in a meeting yesterday and somebody was trying to offer a very complex point, and there were a lot of puzzled faces in the room. And all of a sudden, one of the people said, it's a bit like how Florida can grow oranges and Ontario can't. And so if you use the gardening analogy, why would we try and grow something in Ontario that we can't grow? Oranges grow in Florida. That's Florida's thing. And instead, try and find ways to collaborate. And so on the story went. But when they used a very simple analogy to make a very complex point, all of a sudden, a bunch of light bulbs went off in the room and everybody instantly understood. So never underestimate the value of a very good analogy when you're trying to make a very complex point to a group of stakeholders.
Thanks, Jeremy.
So we had a chance to talk to Chris Cory, a ventureLAB executive in residence. Our AIRs provide entrepreneurs with expert advice to help them grow their businesses.
Over the last year, Chris has developed several seminars to help entrepreneurs understand crowdfunding and crowdfunding for equity.
It's a fairly broad discussion, but it helps entrepreneurs to determine if this type of fundraising is right for them.
So let's jump in.
Hi, I'm Rachel Azaguri.
And I'm Emily Milling, and we're here today with...
Chris Cory.
And we're here today to talk about crowdfunding.
All right, Chris, so crowdfunding in general. Could you just talk about what kind of crowdfunding methods there are and what it's used for?
So crowdfunding is a way in which the whole fundraising process is democratized. Typically what happens is there is an online portal. People are motivated to go to that portal and then select and fund a project of their choosing. There are a number of different crowdfunding platforms, but first let's start with some of the big numbers and the overall statistics. So in 2015, it was estimated that crowdfunding achieved another new high. About $35.5 billion were raised in 2015. And that represents 100% increase, over 100% increase from the year before. How those numbers break down broadly are about $25 billion in peer-to-peer lending, and then another $10 billion comprised of reward-based funding, the kinds of things that you would typically see on Kickstarter and Indiegogo and other similar platforms. And another that's about $5.5 billion, another $2.5 billion in equity crowdfunding, and then associated royalty and other forms of funding.
So there are a couple different types of crowdfunding. Can you explain what they are in a nutshell?
Sure. So there's reward-based funding. That's probably the kind of funding with the most visibility, and that's where you would go on Kickstarter or Indiegogo and fund a project, and typically receive would be buying a product, pre-purchasing a product from the folks who are who are promoting that. That's reward-based. Donation-based, typically used to fund a social enterprise project or a charity. And then, of course, there's equity crowdfunding, where a company is offering shares to the public for investment purposes, and there are a number of rules and regulations surrounding that.
So that crowdfunding for equity is fairly new to Canada.
Yes, brand new, January 2016. The regulations for non-accredited investors were approved, at least in Ontario, and then about 6 months prior to that, they rolled out similar rules for the balance of the country. We have a bit of a challenge here in Canada because we don't have unified securities regulation, so it has to go province by province or region by region.
Would you say that crowdfunding is a viable option for entrepreneurs that want to raise capital?
Oh, absolutely. Crowdfunding is good for entrepreneurs in a couple of ways. One is utilizing Indiegogo or Kickstarter. A product is validated. Investors always want to know if the product has market traction, if you can prove as an entrepreneur that the dog will actually eat the dog food. So this is a great way. And there's a growing trend now of both angel investors and VCs following reward-based crowdfunding programs, and then following on because the product has been validated. The price point in many ways has been validated. And these things become very, more attractive as investment opportunities than perhaps they would be before. Equity crowdfunding is growing. We're very late to the party in Canada. It's been very successful in places like the United Kingdom, where it now represents about 15% of the total angel investment that's occurring in that particular market. In Canada, we're just getting started. I don't think there's been more than $1 million or so raised on various equity crowdfunding platforms, but that number is sure to grow in the weeks and months ahead.
So Chris, can you talk a bit about how traditional capital sourcing compares to crowdfunding for equity, and what are the benefits for crowdfunding for equity versus the traditional methods?
I would say that crowdfunding for equity is better because you have an opportunity to reach out to more people than perhaps you otherwise would. So typical ways of raising private equity, you would go to an underwriter or an agent who would then access their own network of investors. What often happens is that investor network, this I think especially true in Canada, their network of investors may not be large enough to afford them people who might be familiar with the company's technology. So crowdfunding for equity allows you to expand that outreach program. You may be able to touch more investors than you otherwise would. It's also less expensive, or can be less expensive than the traditional methods as well.
What are a couple of the essential things that an entrepreneur should prepare before launching a crowdfunding campaign?
So whether it's an equity campaign or a reward-based campaign, the entrepreneur should be attending to a number of things. One is marketing material, preparing a quality video for the campaign, strategizing over the price point at which either the product will be offered or the shares offered to the public. The kinds of rewards, if it's a rewards-based program, that will be given out, the various tiers of rewards to accommodate both small investors and large investors. And then finally, the importance of preparing the social network in order to promote the campaign and maintain the momentum of the campaign, especially in the early days. So statistically, at least the information provided by both Kickstarter and Indiegogo, there's a great relationship between campaign momentum and campaign success. So these, I think, are prime considerations. Crowdfunding is not free. You have to do a certain amount of preparation. You have to spend a certain amount of money, especially on your video. That seems to be table stakes right now.
So I've heard a lot of horror stories of successful campaigns, actually, of people trying to raise, $25,000, but in the end raising $500,000, and now they've oversold their product and they have to deliver by September, 15,000 pieces or whatever the case is. So how do people prepare for that? You don't know how much you're going to raise. You don't know what's going to happen. So how do you prepare for that? And what's, you get a little bit of backlash. Like how do people figure that out before it even happens?
Sure. No, that's a great question. It is certainly a problem, reward-based crowdfunding. So where some 75% of the campaigns, the product is late in delivery, and people get mad. And what happens is that people haven't fully connected the complete supply chain, and can't get the product to order. And I think what entrepreneurs should be cognizant of, that if you're taking prepayment for a product, it is a contract, and you are obliged to deliver that product and are potentially liable and indeed suable if that doesn't happen.
On the flip side, could you talk about how crowdfunding for equity could affect the scalability of a company?
Certainly in Canada, it's a real challenge to raise capital markets, and we have some terrific gaps, especially in the pre-commercialization stage. To the effect that crowdfunding, reward-based crowdfunding, is effective in validating product and bridging that funding gap, I think it can be very effective, because following that will be the investment capital necessary to scale. What's interesting to me is how these models start colliding, and that's to say the reward-based model, successful reward-based crowdfunding campaign is followed by a venture capital investment to assist companies in scaling. I noticed just the other day that Cedar, an equity crowdfunding platform in England, just successfully closed a financing for a company that was already public. So this wasn't, like a qualifying transaction or initial public offering via crowdfunding. It was actually a follow-on transaction, and I believe there will be more of these. And their motivation for doing so was they wanted to reach out and expand their investor base and try to expand it globally. And to me, this is very, very exciting.
At what point in your business, if you are considering a crowdfunding campaign, at what point in your business should you begin or start a crowdfunding campaign? And how do you know if your company or product is right fit for crowdfunding? When you have a new product and you're not convinced or you're not sure how it's going to be received, you're going to need capital to fund the product. That to me is really the ideal time to test it, because if the product needs tweaking, you'll receive the feedback from the various purchasers, and you'll know what needs to be addressed. Anything else, Chris, that you think we haven't covered that should be covered? Well, like on the equity side, it's not for everybody. And I don't think that people have really considered, small companies have considered the implications. So for example, if you're what's called an accredited investor, like a big investor, and there's a net worth requirement and an annual salary requirement, you can invest in anything online. And people have been doing, because you're deemed to be a sophisticated investor and able to look after your own affairs. But so the big news in crowdfunding, or equity crowdfunding, was a year ago when introduced the regulations for smaller investors. So which means non-accredited guys who can only invest $2,500 a time, total of 4 companies a year for $10,000 in total. So it's conceivable that a small company going to raise that kind of capital could end up with hundreds of shareholders and create a whole nightmare in terms of investor relations. And it's potentially, who wants that? That's a lot of responsibility, and there's 200 people who might sue me, right?
So just to wrap up, what should an entrepreneur be aware of before starting a crowdfunding for equity campaign?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of different kinds of, at least the regulations passed by the Ontario Securities Commission. I'll do this with Ontario now. They're very similar across the country. So the regulators are trying to accommodate, trying to encourage this kind of investment, but at the same time protect investors. So they have tiered investors into a grouping of accredited investors, which are people of high net worth and high salary, and then everyone else. And everyone else is subject to restrictions as to the amount of capital they can invest in any one any one company, and also the total number of crowdfunded investments they can participate in on an annual basis. What entrepreneurs should consider is the number of those type of investors in your offering will determine the number of investors that will have to be administered and taken care of as you go forward. And I think that should be a key consideration for small businesses who wish to rapidly grow. For larger corporations, using the accredited investor exemption, crowdfunding that way, then I don't think there's anything to worry about, or at least any additional administrative burden beyond what they're currently dealing with.
So, Chris, if people want to find out more about crowdfunding, where could they go?
Several sources. The first one I'd recommend is the website of the National Crowdfunding Association of Canada. They've done a great job promoting crowdfunding over the last few years. I'm a member of the number of resources and recent news events happening there.
So Chris, you're also in a few videos that we've posted on YouTube about crowdfunding in general and crowdfunding for equity. So we'll be sure to post those links in our show notes if our listeners would like to learn a little bit more about the process with Chris. Thank you so much for being on the show, Chris.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you, Rachel.
Next up, we hear from Kailey Gilchrist, the sauce boss from Nona Vegan. Kailey has been working towards healthy food alternatives for individuals with food sensitivities or preferences. The sauce is made from cashews, which adds the creamy texture that dairy sauces provide.
Although vegan is in the title, this sauce is also safe for people with a gluten intolerance, diabetes, and other special requirements.
Hi, I'm Kailey Gilchrist, and I am the sauce boss of Nona Vegan Foods. Nona solves the problem of making delicious meals for people who have dietary restrictions. So whether that's people with lactose intolerance, gluten intolerance, avoiding cholesterol, diabetic, even just people looking for a really healthy alternative, it solves that problem by making a delicious product that's easy to prepare, comes in a jar. They just pick it up at the grocery store and they can, make it in minutes and serve it to their family. I started the company in June of 2013, so it's been just over 3 years now. The cold, hard truth about being an entrepreneur. I think the most difficult part for me is the loneliness of it. It's ultimately, at the end of the day, everything's up to me. It's up to me who I follow up with, how I follow through with projects, all the financial burden. Everything is riding on my shoulders. So there's a great deal of loneliness in that, so it's that I think is the hardest day-to-day part. And in that loneliness, sometimes it can be really difficult to feel motivated because it's, you are your own boss. You're the only one telling yourself that you have whatever deadline. So sometimes I struggle with that daily motivation to okay, get up now, your alarm clock's going off, go and do the work that you said you were going to do and, make money and get everything done. So I think that's a challenging part. There are many amazing parts as well. One piece of advice for new entrepreneurs, try to build up a community around yourself, build up a team right from the get-go, especially if you're a solopreneur. If this is a solo venture, you need to be building that team, building that community, having mentors and people you can bounce ideas off of so that you don't fall into a pit of lonely despair. I think that I wish that I had done some of that earlier. I was so determined to do everything on my own. And, yes, there's great pride in that, but I think that it's a less joyous path than if you, right from the get-go, build a team and a community around yourself. One of the biggest highlights of being an entrepreneur for me has been hearing from customers whose lives we've really touched by doing what we do. So, sometimes I get people, just very heartfelt testimonials, I guess, of people writing in and just saying, my kids don't eat anything, they're allergic to everything, they hate vegetables, blah, 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 et cetera, but they love your sauce. Thank you for producing something that's delicious and my whole family eats it and my husband doesn't even complain about it. You know, like those, when I read those, it just warms my heart, and then everything's just, all the bad bits are just totally worth it. So I've been working with ventureLAB for about 8 months now, and one of the overarching experiences I always walk away with after meeting with one of the ventureLAB mentors or doing a presentation for a panel there is this feeling of hope. I know that probably sounds really cheesy, but I always leave and I feel very inspired and motivated and empowered, like I can do this. Like I feel very encouraged. You know, and it means so much coming from you guys, because everybody there has so much experience and business background that when they say like, wow, this is a fantastic idea, you're doing really well, this is where I see this going, like you're going to do it. It just like, it means so much, and they're like the best little cheerleaders. So next up for Nona Vegan, we are trying to launch into the food service market. So right now we sell jars of sauce, Alfredo cheesy and carbonara, and we sell them to retailers. So we're in Whole Foods, we're in a couple Loblaws, a lot of health food stores, and I want to reach even more people than that. And so I'd like to start selling our sauces in hospitals. I think that, you know, the underprivileged populations, people in hospitals, they need good food. Kids at university, you know, more and more people are lactose intolerant, gluten intolerant. They need those options. So I want to reach out to institutions, restaurants, hospitals, and get Nona out there to more people in food service. So you can check out our website, and it's www.nonavegan.com, NONAVEGAN.com, and we've got meal ideas up there. We've got all the stores that we're sold at and upcoming events and stuff like that.
I'd like to thank everyone for being on our show today. Jeremy, Laurin, Chris Cory, and Kailey Gilchrist.
Next month, we'll be talking about women in business with entrepreneur Jean Leggett from One More Story Games out of Barrie and our client services manager, Michelle Lochin. She will be our guest host.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to tweet us at ventureLAB.ca and find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram.
More information can be found on our website at venturelab.ca.
And if you like the show and want to send us a little love, remember to rate and review and subscribe on iTunes. That helps more people like you find our show.
See you next time.
Bye. This episode and the original music was produced by Emily Milling. ventureLAB is a regional innovation center that works with entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, and the companies that want to work with them in York Region, Simcoe County, and Muskoka District. ventureLAB is part of the Ontario Network of Entrepreneurs.
It's like my Uncle Bill and Auntie March.
Can we talk about that? Let's just talk about that.
So Uncle Bill and Auntie March. So
Why don't we call it, that's our podcast, Chris telling stories.
So Chris, thank you very much for being on the show, and best of luck with your life. I don't know how to end this.
Thank you very much, Emily, and the same to you. That's it.